Thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you for coming, and thank you very much, Dalibor and Marie, for the invitation also. And I prepared it in English, and I wanted only symbolically to start with a graphic novel. I bring the book at the end once again, and you see it's on the right. Jews are a stubborn lot. We never gave up on anarchism like the Spaniards and the Italians. So it refers to anarchism, Durruti in the Catalan case, and also to Italy, because of Italy had a lot of anarchist thinkers and activists. It's the Freie Arbeiterstimme. It's a very important journal. I will come shortly to it when I speak about Rudolf Rocker. And on the left, you have also Die Junge. It was a very important group in New York who wanted to break up with the sweatshop poetry I will present today a little bit. And started to make a kind of modernist Yiddish literature. Deborah Vogel, with whom I will end, was in contact with them, for example. My topic today is anarchism and avant-garde, and it is a sub-project of a larger project, a so-called Sonderforschungsbereich, you know, the awful German words somehow in science, a collaborative research center. I'm from the Viadrina there in the Free University, and we have a Yiddish project and a Ukrainian studies project, and that's why I'm still, I would like to say, still a work of progress, I could say. We have still 2 years in which I will go to the YIVO also this year, hopefully, and research a little bit in the archives. The sub-project analyzes radical, historical, and contemporary avant-garde art practices. Practices, the most important word in our project, that combine cooperative actions with theoretical reflections in order to intervene artistically. That's the title of our project. The focus is on East Central Europe, but Italy's futurists are included selectively. So they are a kind of important thing for the avant-garde. Not easy, but important. These avant-garde first actors were particularly effective with their actions. International anarchism is seen as the missing link, that's our thesis, you could say, between the theory and the practice of the avant-gardes. Due to the nationalization of the art in the 1930s, these alliances lost their practical character, were weakened, destroyed, or pushed into the private sphere, but were reactivated in the current protest cultures. And that's the example my colleague, the PhD student Irina Kovalenko, is showing here in the Maidan. That's her project, you could say. And it's also in this Yiddish project. And you can see all the good and bad effects we had already in the 1920s. The research questions are: is anarchism a missing link between avant-garde and anarchism? The radicality of form and action in avant-garde art, how did this develop or come about? Why did the avant-garde art no longer want to be just autonomous art like in the 19th century? Why went they into action, you could say? Why did the avant-gardes include many artists from non-bourgeois social classes who had nothing to lose from a change of system? And especially in my project, the Jews in avant-garde see art as a part of the process of emancipation in the late anti-Semitic Soviet Union, Russian Empire. Were Yiddish literatures particularly involved in this? Probably you don't know a lot about anarchism, or maybe only the normal topics. So let us start with anarchism a little bit and look what was it, or what are the important topics. Today, anarchism and serious research on it is a marginal phenomenon in academia. It disappeared as a movement when communism triumphed in the form of Bolshevism. After this defeat, there was no longer any room for anarchism. They were anyway partially disavowed or discredited, you could say, by the terrorist arm, which was particularly prominent in the 80s and 90s in Europe, and later also in America, North America. Anarchism had lost out to Marxism through the revolution in the Russian Empire, even though the anarchist movement, and not many people know about this, was once a very huge movement. The dispute between these two guys, you know very well, the dispute between Karl Marx and Bakunin in Genève in the middle of the 19th century can be seen as an emblematic scene of this victory for Marx followers. The nucleus of this dispute was the cultural chauvinism of the empires and the communist enthusiasm for a strong state, which anarchists such as Bakunin, but later also Mikhail Drahomanev from Ukraine, for example, did not share. And I have a small excerpt. It's called Bakunin Schrift gegen Marx. I have also the German version, but I will read the longer English one. Here it's Bakunin speaking on Marx. Here's what separates Mr. Marx from Mr. Bismarck. So that's a very funny combination, you could say. It's the form and the condition of government. One is an aristocrat and even a monarchist. The other is really a democrat, a social democrat, and a republican socialist into the bargain. We see now what unites them. It's the real cult of the state. I have no need to prove in the case of Mr. Bismarck. His proofs have been given. He's a man of the state, from head to toe, and nothing but a man of the state. But I do not believe I shall have too hard a time proving that it is the same with Mr. Marx. He loves government so much that he has wished to institute one even in the International Working Men's Association. And he so adores power that he has wished that he still intends today to impose his dictatorship upon us. So you can see a little bit, there are big books about this dispute. I'm not a Marxist scholar. Also, Bakunin is not one of my main topics, but it's very important of this discussion about dictatorship of the party and state. Kropotkin's death, and I have a small thing on Kropotkin later on, but I think he's the most popular anarchist, so probably everybody knows at least the name. In 1921, marked this end of anarchism, you could say, even if there were still many important writings and actions up to the Second World War. After Kropotkin's death, the fight against Bolshevism and fascism dominated, and anarchism only led a niche existence. Many Jewish supporters of anarchism were murdered by the Germans in the Holocaust and during the occupation. Landauer was murdered already in 1919, as you know. Mühsam dies in the concentration camp in Oranienburg. Anarchism actually only survived in the USA, you could say, mostly in the UK also, and in the underground, and sometimes as a fashionable style and attitude. Maybe this was also a good sign, because so democracy no longer needs anarchism, you could say. Nevertheless, it has been gaining some ground recently, and some new studies were published. For example, this one, maybe you know it already, History of Jewish Anarchism with Freedom in Our Ears, by Anotace, and I bring also the latest book, and Kenton Zimmer. If Rosa Luxemburg ideas on the freedom and of those who think differently, the famous word of the Freiheit der Andersdenkenden, are still held in such high esteem by communists today, one wonders why the readers of Luxemburg were never interested in anarchist ideas of freedom, who placed the concept of freedom at the center of their theory and practice, and not the freedom of a state or class. Nevertheless, when we look at historical anarchist concepts today, we must bear in mind that they were developed in the context of totally lawlessness, and of course in the context of the empires. That's why we have so many also Jewish anarchists among them. Many things they thought are no longer up to date in our vision. Although the well-known key figures of anarchism like Proudhon or Bakunin came from big nations, there are many representatives of smaller nations among the anarchists. And there are striking overlaps with the avant-garde with regard to cooperation, and I will speak a lot about cooperation, freedom of the individual, trying out a form of livings or the forms of living, and combining life with art and politics. So what distinguishes anarchism from communism that made it especially attractive to the art system would be the question. And in this book by two Yiddish scholars from New York, I saw them at least only in New York, I don't remember now where the alma mater is, they gave a first definition of anarchism. Anarchism's total rejection of the state as a political form or tool for systemic change separates it from most other leftist movements. So, total rejection. And I bring always this when I'm speaking about this kind of popular anarchism. And yeah, he didn't speak a lot of Yiddish, I think. But Groucho Marx makes it pretty obvious that you could say anarchism, yeah, they are against anything, yeah. But it's not so easy, and they didn't make things so easy. And that's why the authors provided a second definition. Rather than seizing state power, anarchists aim to model and transform social relations through the cultivation of mutual aid and comradeship. Anarchist organizations therefore seek to implement forms of non-hierarchical decision-making and non-domination, and pursue social change through practices of direct action, whether in the form of education, non-violent protest, or armed resistance, rather than through election state officials or taking power. As Emma Goldman, Red Emma, probably you have heard of her, she wrote sometimes in Yiddish, also in English, but also in other languages, and she's a very important figure in this kind of research. As Emma Goldman argued in her critique of the communist dictatorship in Russia, human experiences teach us that methods and means cannot be separated from the ultimate aim. The means employed become, through individual habit and social practice, part and parcel of the final purpose. Their influence modify it, and presently the aims and means become identical. So, rather than seizing state power, anarchists aim to model and change social relations through the cultivation of mutual aid, solidarity, and cooperativism. So in the ideal case, you could say, yeah, it's like the theory they want to promote. They do not believe that the means to achieve their goals are meaningless. Not all anarchists were non-violent, as we know. There was the terrorist arm of anarchism, but they experimented rather with ways of living, Lebensform, I would call them in German. And anarchist organizations therefore strive for forms of non-hierarchical decision-making, non-domination, and social change through practices of direct action. You know, there's also the French right-wing speaking of Aktion direkt, so it's not easy, but oder Philosophie der Tat, yes, if you take it, but it's really this kind of thinking that you have to take philosophy into the society through action, and it's a difficult thing as we know. But the interesting thing with Emma Goldman is really the thing that she didn't think you could suspend humanity for a certain time, as the communists thought. You have to do violence to achieve at the end your aim. She never thought, she always promoted, and other anarchists also, if it doesn't work in your everyday life, it also won't work in a big society. And that's the interesting difference, and that makes it maybe, that's the appeal maybe for artists and artist group to make this kind of experiment in their avant-garde groups, how to live in bigger societies or in bigger groups. And that's very interesting that Emma Goldman speaks about that, and they made them a lot of experiments. She had a lot of lovers and triangle things. All the anarchists never married, because marriage is an institution and they're against institutions and so on. And that's a very interesting part for a lot of Yiddish writers and also Yiddish thinkers, you could say. They were also initially only organized on a federal basis. And in other words, they didn't look for power through the siege of power or the dictatorship of one party, as Marx thought it and Lenin developed it then in the Russian Revolution. This was very appealing to the classical avant-garde from 1909 to 1939. I brought you also a photograph of Emma Goldman. If you didn't remember, that's her autobiography. I think she wrote it in Russian at the end, but you know, they always switched languages. We have always a lot of languages of every anarchist, because they had to leave countries all the time, yeah? They were exposed, they have to leave from Germany to UK, then from the UK to the States, then they tried out the Soviet Union, or the beginning of the Soviet Union, and all the anarchists said, no, it won't work, we have to leave. Kropotkin also knew that it would end badly. She did the last talk on the grave of Kropotkin in Moscow, but she went away once again. And I looked up one... also, I looked up what they say about her, and she was always called the infamous anarchist Emma Goldman. And in this article, they think she will be expelled very early on. Eine der ersten Personen, deren Ausweisung aus England nach dem Inkrafttreten der neuen Verordnung zu erwarten ist, wird die Anarchistin Emma Goldman sein, die kürzlich von Berlin nach London gekommen ist. Genau, so that's a typical life of an anarchist, you could say, always switching countries. So like a lot of Yiddish authors also. So the two American authors also quote Emma Goldman, the most important Yiddish and Russian-speaking Jewish anarchist, you could say, who here in an infamous sentence criticizes the communist dictatorship in Soviet Russia with the teaching quote that human experience, that methods and means cannot be separated from the actual goal. The means employed become, through individual habit and social practice, a part of the final end. They influence and modify it, and finally ends and means become identical. With the reference to the dictatorship of the proletariat, she draw on the debate that the anarchist Bakunin and the communist Marx had already conducted with vehemence. It was also about a question of nationalization of the means of production and property versus cooperative administration of communal property, which was preferred by the anarchists, who always favored self-organization over state organization, you could say. Ricarda Huch summarized the anarchist criticism in Michel Bakunin and Anarchy in 1923, a very interesting book on Bakunin when you read it today. Bakunin wanted to get things flowing and keep them flowing, whereas Marx wanted to fortify them even more. Bakunin hated the state, Marx wanted to nationalize the state even more. Emma Goldman, together with other Jewish and non-Jewish anarchists, therefore became a great critic of the Soviet Union, in which Lenin realized his idea of dictatorship, which Marx had only sketched out. If you go through these and other anarchist writings, like also Kropotkin's, you quickly realize that anarchism does not see itself as a system based on the avant-garde, you could say, of the proletariat in the same way as communism or the work of Marx, but mostly on personalities. And that's also an important point which will influence then the Yiddish artists and authors. Because it's very close to the art system, you could say. It has this bourgeois touch for a Leninist, but it's very important to notice that it's not a kind of closed work like Marxism. You have to read Capital or something. It's very difficult to say what is the anarchist idea, you could say. It's not so easy because you have a great range from Godwin in The Father of Mary Shelley until maybe in the 20s or in the 30s. I read everything, you could say, or nearly everything, but it's very difficult to put the things together. I try to give you the most important things maybe for our theme. Anarchists, you can say, were mostly the exemplary representatives of anarchism, not thinkers. Person, not oeuvre. They mostly live what they teach. All stood for their ideas with their lives and lifestyles. And also the terrorists, you could say, which died very often. Some also weren't terrorists and have to die, like some famous cases. They were not state administrators, professors for philosophy, or professional politicians. They personally stood up for what is the highest principle of anarchism, which still irritates us today, I would say, the rejection of representation, be it the state, the church, or the military. No one should represent anyone, say nearly all the anarchists. So that's a very important phrase for them, that everything has to be authentic, you could say. But how can everything be authentic? How can you live without a police, without a state? Very often people ask. No one should represent anyone. This was based on a totally positive image of mankind. Yeah, they have a very positive outlook on what people are, how they cooperate. And by the way, you could also say this is also the reason why anarchists are often against Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan and the social contract. That is the way to contain the evil side of mankind. Yeah, that's coming from a kind of imagination that people are evil and you have to contain them. That's why you have the social contract, and the state is doing things to evade this evil side of mankind. They did not need a social contract because they interpreted the state of human nature positively. They were in favor of federalism instead of centralism. They were for freedom, solidarity, and cooperation. The success of the proletariat was certainly also important to the anarchists, especially for the anarchists, for example, in the sweatshops in New York. But the future did not depend on it. Anarchism was both more classless and more focused on the rural population. And that's very interesting also for our case. That's a difference to a lot of Yiddish anarchists who were rarely farmers. As you know, when you know a little bit about Jewish history in Central and Eastern Europe, we have Tewe, who is a milkman, you could say, but that's a rare case. And so either came from the Pale of Settlement, or had to toil in the sweatshops in America, or in some new fabric also in the Russian Empire, or in the interwar Poland. Two authors I mentioned later wrote about this brutal situation. But the autonomous farmers and craftsmen, and there were a lot of Jewish craftsmen among them, were at the center of anarchist attention. If one had to name a class or a stratum that had a great influence on the texts and actions of anarchists, then it would certainly be the craftsmen, including the enslaved tailors and seamstresses, and even the petit bourgeois, the famous Kleinbürger, as researcher James Scott said. Often, like in the case of Proudhon, they came from this group. There were also that's maybe an important case for our literary research. There was also no attribution that a proletarian, or as a proletarian, you had to read and write workers' literature. Yeah. You could also produce bourgeois literature. That's also an interesting thing, that the communists think so workers should do worker literature and maybe go through bourgeois literature to workers' literature and classless literature at the end. But it was not an obstacle for anarchist thinkers. There is no imagined determined historical development from feudal literature to bourgeois literature, from workers' literature to classless literature. Among the anarchists, one finds former princes and nobles, but also craftsmen like Proudhon or Rudolf Rocker, and woman workers like Emma Goldman, who was a Büstenmacher. I can't say, it's like a corset maker. Anarchist was perhaps not class blind, but thinking in terms of groups and classes in Marx theory was quite alien to it. In this sense, Lenin was right when the individualism of the anarchists reminded him of bourgeoisie or even romanticism. And he called it a bourgeois individualism turned inside out, to discredit it. This freedom towards the bourgeois artistic also had its attraction for artists and avant-garde artists especially. Many anarchists also attributed individualism and stubbornness a spirit of resistance and opposition to the lower classes, and did not see them as object to be liberated by the party avant-garde. The anarchists did not see themselves as liberators of the oppressed proletariats. Maybe they educated them in this kind of socialist thinking, but rather as supporters of freedom-loving approaches among the worker, the peasantry, and among the craftsmen, as Kropotkin, for example, put it. And this love for freedom and individualism earned the anarchists the love of many artists and art lovers, even among the working class, and the contempt and hostility of the communists, who in some way ultimately triumphed over the anarchists. More than the concept of justice, the anarchists seem to have been driven by the concept of freedom and solidarity. They organized themselves into smaller regional groups, such as later the artistic bohemians and the avant-garde circles, but not into big parties. The anarchists were passionate and willing to make sacrifices. They understood less about tactics. They did not become criminals like the Bolsheviks, apart from the terrorist arm. And they did not seek classlessness, but gave illiterate lumpenproletariat and ordinary people a hope for change. There were anarchists in all European countries from the 19th century onwards, in Italy and the Italian parts of Austria-Hungary, among the Ukrainians and the Jews of the Russian Empire. However, there were always particularly many supporters of anarchism in the Russian Empire. It didn't originate from there, but it was the most visible, I think, around the time of the avant-garde. And the last sentence, and I will shift to examples. anarchists were already crowdfunding or talking about counterculture when this was not yet generally on vogue like in our time or in the 1960s. They were rarely on a violent mission like the communists, but instead focused on testing and prefiguring, and that's an important word, maybe a term often used by David Graeber, prefiguring on a small scale what they wanted to do on a large scale. They had an almost artistic idea of intervening in society with society and not as a state. So I think you're already a little bit, and I will speak now a little bit more freely about a few examples we have in our materials. There are a lot of more people. Maybe you know him. You know him? Yes. It's a very interesting case, and I think we don't have enough research. There's the materials are lying in Amsterdam. I don't know. I don't think somebody is working on him. It's an interesting case. He's Rudolf Rocker. He's, you could say, a guy who learned a lot of Yiddish and translated, for example, I can show it here, Kropotkin into Yiddish. Yeah, that's the book von der Revolutionär von 96. Kropotkin, everything of Kropotkin was in Yiddish, but this book on the right, where there is Parole d'une révoltée above, if you don't read Yiddish, is translated by Rocker, for example. So, but he was a normal Christian craftsman, you could say, from Mainz, but did fall in love with Mille Wittkop. There's a K, I think, and learned Yiddish, especially in the East End in London. And we have a lot of films also and memoirs on this time in London. And so he's a kind of Yiddishist, you could say, also a socialist, syndicalist, and especially anarchist. And that's a very interesting case because he also went through all the stages. He had this contact with the Central Eastern European anarchists. He went to the UK. He knew the Germans. He went to the States, came also once again back. And shows also that Yiddish anarchism wasn't only a Jewish thing, you could say. A lot of non-Jewish people were also attracted. And he learned Yiddish because in the East End were so many Yiddish workers in small apartments pressed together, and he agitated them in Yiddish, you could say. Yeah? There was also a religious part, but anarchism and you could say partly was not could be combined also with religion in this time. There were the others who didn't want to connect with the anarchists, but there was also the combination between religion and anarchism partly. So he translated, and Kropotkin is always the most important figure, maybe because you could say he was the philosopher of mutualism. He was this kind of person, which is so interesting in our project because avant-garde, you could say, is group working. Groups who work together in the avant-garde. They work together and write together. We know about the famous manifest mostly, who is written maybe down with 3-4 names, but they work together also in their action, in making theater, maybe scandalizing. And he was the one who worked on it. Here, you could say a small part of his autobiography, and he wrote it in Yiddish, as you see. And we don't have the edition, only partly. There's also a Surkamp book from the 70s. You can read a part of his autobiography. And I took only out the one with the Yiddish connection. And it's in Paris. You imagine a beautiful spring evening in Paris. And also Rudolf Rocker, was walking along the Grand Boulevard in Paris with my friend Liederle, surrounded by the splendor and buzz of life, which always had an enchanting effect on me. My friend asked me if I would like to go with him to a meeting of Jewish anarchists. In Yiddish, it would be difficult if it's in Yiddish to understand if it's Yiddish anarchists or Jewish anarchists. You know the problem. Jewish anarchists. At first I thought he was joking, but when I realized he was serious, I asked him in surprise, Jewish anarchists? Not Catholic or Protestant anarchists? No, he replied, I'm telling you, they are not religious Jews, but they are Jews who have as much to do with religion as we do. Well then, I said to him, they are no longer Jews any more than we are Christians. He explained to me that so he didn't understand all about Jewishness, but okay. He explained to me that they were so-called Eastern Jews from Russia, Poland, and Romania, who form a separate ethnic group and speak a language that sounds similar to German. A nation's position on the Jews is a touchstone for its ability to progress as a society. The spirit of democracy and liberalism has opened the gates of the old ghetto to equality and led to legal equality. So we have the emancipation thing. And you know probably here all that in the Russian Empire, Jews didn't get equality. In time of the empire. They did get it with the revolution, but not before. You didn't have the equal rights like in the Habsburg Empire or in Prussia. With all the forts, the other states also had. But in Russian Empire, it was a very anti-Semitic Russian Empire at the end. You didn't have equal rights like Russians, you could say, ethnical Russians. It was a very big problem. The gates of the old ghetto to equality led to legal equality. Whoever locks the Jews back into the old ghetto locks himself in the even bigger ghetto of barbarism and spiritual darkness. National Socialist Germany is the best proof of this. The exclusion of Jews from public life has not made the German people any freer or happier. It was written in retrospective. And here we have once again erste Begegnis mit jiddische Anarchisten in Freie Arbeiterstimme. It's the same journal, and he had already in the UK a journal. That's the American journal. It's the same journal. I gave you an example with a graphic novel at the beginning. And so until now I couldn't find with Rudolf Rocker really avant-garde, you could say, relations. That's not the thing. He's not an avant-garde thinker, but he's very near to a lot of writers, a lot of authors, you could say, and it would be interesting to go further and to look up all the connections he had and the things he wrote. That's the page of the Freie Arbeiterstimme after his death in September 1958. The journal lived until 1977. There's also a small film about closing up this anarchist journal. You can see it's like the first page. So he was a really big name at his time. But it was already a kind of post-anarchism, you could say. It didn't really work anymore. But and I'm not sure. I don't think that in the 60s there were much attention to people like Rudolf Rocker, a little bit, which shows the book by Surkamp Verlag, where there's a translation. But it was a very big thing. But let us go to other journals, and here we have a Morris Rosenfeld, one of the sweatshop poets, and Kafka is quoting him here in Prague when he gives his performance. He was one of the 3 authors he's giving in his speech on Yiddish. Probably Löwy told about him. So he was very, very popular in the 90s and around 1900. I think he's nearly forgotten. We don't read these poems anymore. Also, if we're interested in Yiddish literature, but still as a historian of literature, it's still interesting to read Maurice Rosenfeld. And you see also the sweatshop situation in the illustration. There are Lilienthal illustrations, so very famous. I think there's a Czech edition. There was the first one even, I think. And then there's a very early one in a German edition. I will bring you the beginning of one poem. I looked up the English edition, especially for here. And maybe to introduce this kind of poetry in this Liedersammlung, you have titles like My Boy, What is the World, Despair, The Candle Seller, Depression, September Melodies, My Youth in the Wilderness, Journalism, The Jewish May, The Feast of Lies. So we have a lot of, it's like the everyday of a sweatshop worker, you could say. The despair, the problems, the holidays, the old sweatshop worker, the younger, the woman with the child. You have everything. And it's a kind of diary, you could say, he's showing here. And the special thing is that a lot of these poems were also published in the journals. So, like to push awareness. And yeah, that's the one. As I said, a lot of the edition is very beautiful. If you look it up, it's nearly everything is online, and also the Czech edition, Wyrlicki, I think, did the translation. Yes, I looked it up once for Kafka. So Wyrlicki was very important in this case, and I think it was earlier. I think the Czech one is one of the earliest. So maybe there's also a kind of anarchist thing there. I have to look it up. Yeah, maybe we will read to give a little bit of taste. In the factory, oh, here in the shop, the machines roll so widely that often unaware that I am or have been, I think am lost in the terrible tumult. And void is my soul. I'm but a machine. I work and work and I work, never ceasing, create and create things from morning till end. For what and for whom? Oh no, I know not, oh, ask not whoever has heard of a conscious machine. So we have already this kind of machine and worker. You have the I who is living it through. You have the empathy and the struggle, the feelings, and also a lot of creative, if you look in the Yiddish original, a lot of expression, a little bit like in expressionism, to transmit a lot of feelings to the reader and compassion. Yeah, that's the Yiddish edition, who was partly also the collection of the poems. I didn't find the original in English online. And interesting is also the German edition. We have the Star of David. So at the end, the editions are very beautiful. He was a very important poet in this case. And Lieder is poem. And also here, the dates, like all the people I showed to you, are born in the Russian Empire, sometimes in Poland, sometimes in Belarus, sometimes in Lithuania. And the translations were very important people. Leo Wiener, he left then Yiddish studies and went into Russian studies, so a common way for many people. And Bertolt Pfeiffer, who is also a very important translator for the field of Yiddish. But that's all nach Athen. Another poet who's very interesting in this case is David Edelstadt. He came, I think, from Belarus, and ended also in the sweatshops. And he died very early on. There's also a dissertation on him and anarchism, so there's already people who worked on him. And I brought only one poem, Anarchy, a world with rulers without change, without tears, a world full of love and harmony, where the happiness of the one will not disturb the second. That is Anarchy. He had a lot of anarchistic poems, and he was radicalized, you could say. He was the one who started, you could say, writing poems and bringing poems also to journals, because he was radicalized by the Haymarket event, a very famous event for Yiddish literates in the United States, because he knew one of the persons who was then killed, and that's why he started to be part of the anarchist movement in this time. And with him you can see also, you can see two things if you're studying him. You could say a social motive in his poetry, empathy to all the workers, and trying to convince them also to connect to each other and to work against the bad working conditions. And the second thing, which is important for avant-garde, this going to do something against it in publishing it in a journal and not in a small book with poetry, you could say. And it was a kind of jump from being a poet who's writing poems at home somewhere and maybe publishing it at the end, and maybe you have a small circle, to do poems to radicalize also, you could say, other workers. And that was very early on. Similar things are happening in Italy in this time, and that's a very important thing we want to work off. Another example would be, and I brought it in I did one conference only on the poem of Jakob Gladstein. And this is the Sacco Vanzetti Monday. I wondered when I started learning Yiddish, maybe 25 years ago, who is Sacco Vanzetti? Because every Yiddishist spoke about Sacco Vanzetti. Okay, the Italians also know, but Sacco Vanzetti was a kind of Jewish topic or a Yiddish topic, you could say. Also in Berlin, we have a street. And this was a kind, you can see the relation between the Italian anarchist groups and Yiddish anarchist groups, for example, here. The two were, how do you say, hingerichtet, executed then, forcibly executed. And the case was very popular in Berlin and Rome and Milan. And Jakob Gladstein made a poem really at the day of the execution, you could say. You can look it up. It's also translated in a very good translation in Geweb. Is a translation, and it's very interesting to see it. It's not really propaganda, you could say. It's really very sensible style, speaking about the sun and everything. But it's an example that for transnational anarchism and going into poetry. And the interesting thing in the poem is the time when it was published, also in a journal, you could say. It was not a poem reflection afterwards. It was also a poem who wanted to say it's not just that these two Italians were falsely executed. So you have a lot of motives, you could say, but you see already in this early time also this kind of going into action. Maybe a small look on the official, you could say, combination between anarchism and avant-garde. And one of the first journal who had the name of avant-garde was also the second title, Organe collectiviste et anarchiste, you could say. So from early on, anarchism and avant-garde had something in common. But only lately, I think, maybe it started 10 years ago, we have books which want to look into this case in various literatures in various cultures. Nina Gurianova for the aesthetics of anarchy in the early Russian avant-garde. I'm sure there are also maybe Ukrainians inside, or a newer publication of Mark Mattern, who is doing anarchism as a kind of empowerment, in my view. So it's like of kind of new anarchism, or inventing anarchism once again. Situated at the intersection, that's from his introduction of anarchist and democratic theory. Anarchism and art focuses on 4 popular art forms: do-it-yourself, punk music, poetry slam, graffiti and street art, and flash mobs. You see this kind of happening or doing art in public spaces. Yeah, it's very often combined with anarchistic tactics, and there is probably a connection about it. Let us come to an author I like very much, to Deborah Vogel, and to let us end with another kind of anarchism, you could say, and that's the Western, or the more artistic kind of anarchism in avant-garde. And the poet Deborah Vogel is the most famous example maybe for it. We don't have much Deborah Vogels which this kind of style. We have maybe Peretz Markish, or David Hofstein, or a few others, but she's very special for Yiddish literature. That's one of her book, Talkfiguren, published in 1930 in Poland. Henrik Streng gave illustrations. He was a critic also of art. She mostly did her articles on art in Polish, and her artistic work, like the poetry, she did in Yiddish. She was a friend of Rachel Auerbach, probably know her, who survived one of the few, the Warsaw Ghetto, and looked for the archive. She went then to Israel, wrote a lot of books. The book on Majdanek, for example, we don't have the translation of her book on Majdanek until now, only to speak about a Holocaust theme. He wrote also about her friendship with Deborah Vogel. And if you don't know, she was very popular now. When we started to look at her in the 98 or 97, nobody knew her. We knew about her because we read Bruno Schulz, but before nobody knew something about her. And Rachel Auerbach spoke Yiddish from her family life, but Deborah Vogel spoke Hebrew, Polish and German, because he was in Vienna during the First World War. But she decided to switch to Yiddish. It was very special to switch to Yiddish in Lviv, in Lemberg in this time. And so her Yiddish is, you could say, a little bit Deutschmerisch. But she's also a very philosophical author, because she did her PhD on Hegel with Josef Kremer, a very famous Hegelianer in Lviv. We don't have until now the dissertation of her. We only know a kind of description. And so he started a very philosophical way to do literature and poems. And she, you could say, somehow she's one of this avant-gardists who are following up the slogan of Bakunin. You know the slogan probably, you have heard it. I didn't do a German translation, English translation. I thought I did, but probably I did not bring the right PowerPoint, or didn't. Bakunin wrote in a pseudonym Jules Elisard in October 1842 in in Deutsche Jahrbücher für Wissenschaft und Kunst. Lasst uns also dem ewigen Geist vertrauen, der nur deshalb zerstört und vernichtet, weil er dann unergründliche und ewig schaffende Quell allen Lebens ist. Und there's the phrase, die Lust der Zerstörung ist zugleich eine schaffende Lust. And that's, you could say, a kind of word of all the avant-gardists, yeah? Break up the world. Is it a word of painting, of forms, of sounds like Schönberg, or of words like then the people did like the Dadaists or Chlebnikov or a lot of other authors, and create something new, totally new. You could say the amimetic cut. And Deborah Vogel is one of the people who did this kind of cut. You can also read Rancière if you want to look how this kind of anarchistic thinking is part of other modern thinking about literature. And Rancière was very fashionable maybe 10 years ago, and he says something like that. Entire modernist ideology, he doesn't speak of avant-garde, but he's thinking of avant-garde. It's constructed on the completely simplistic image of a great anti-representational rupture at a certain moment. Supposedly nobody represents anymore, nobody copies models, art applies its own efforts to its own materials, and in the process each form of art becomes autonomous. And you could say in this sense, the break with representation, like the anarchists always claim, is part of the avant-garde thinking of many, many authors. I don't think it's the most important trait of Yiddish literature, but it's more a very important trait of French or German avant-garde to think like this. And there's, let me say maybe one more thing. There's also a genealogy of anarchism and formalism, because the brother of Boris Eichenbaum was a famous anarchist, you could say. And so there are other links also with Shklovsky, who quoted Tolstoy, who is also a kind of anarchistic thinker in some prose. And in this sense, you can say the ideology of modernity, as Rancière said, is connected to this kind of anarchist thinking against representation. And what does this mean? And I want to end with two poems. I have the one also in Yiddish from Deborah Vogel. We have an English translation by Anastasia Lubas, I think is her name. So I didn't have to translate it in English by myself. That's, you could say, her first poem. The first poem of Togfiguren. And it's called in English Rectangles. It's made probably in 1924. So 6 years before it's published. So in the high time of anarchism, of avant-garde. And I will read it slowly. A grey rectangle, a second, a third. 7 times the tin rectangle opens. Yellow sun, red sun, on one side, on another. The day rectangle has closed. Grey tin birds hover. Lumps of soft dough with 2 hands and 2 feet roll in the grey light, a clay of light. 4 times a day. Yellow sun on one side of the rectangle, on the other. A first month of stiff tin flowers. A second, a third month of sticky tin flowers, hands and cloth. How many times it has opened, how many times closed, the tin rectangle with the yellow sun circle on both sides. So that's the very first poem by Deborah Vogel, and it throws, you could say, the reader into a geometric landscape without warning. Spheres, rectangles, squares can be found everywhere. the whole of life fits into the square, in little lumps of days from the beginning, always lost. In Deborah Vogel's work, however, the square is no longer an abysmal, sacred, even terrifying force, as in Malevich's work, but merely a container for the bored soul of modernity. Quote, a square surface of sweet monotony is life, is the world. And another quote from Manne Keenan, it's a later work of her, and I will show you only how she wants to somehow, she tries also to change a little bit the typography in her books. She's without pictures, but somehow she wants to do somehow pictures with words, was very often in this time. And as you can see, she has this kind of repetition all the time, the monotony. And red and blue streetcars take tired passengers back to the flat house where they live, each under a different number. First stop, second stop, third. Broad Street, Long Street, Garden Street. Garden Street, Long Street, Broad Street. First stop, second stop, third. And if you know Yiddish a little bit, it's easy to read. Maybe also you have also this Erster Gass, Lange Gass, Gartengass, and then Gartengass, Lange Gass, Breite Gass. So it's like trying to do all this monotony the whole time. The words represent himself, and there's only a glimmer of the empirical world as is from afar. This too is a path of the avant-garde that anarchism has helped to shape as a theory, a break with reality. Yiddish literature rarely had the time and leisure to unfold in this way, like Deborah Vogel, I think. It's really, that's why it's so fascinating to read her, because it's not typical for Yiddish literature. Yiddish literature was, as Kafka wrote here in Prague 112 years ago, a kleine Literatur in this time that had to seek above all the fundamental connection with politics, Zusammenhang mit Politik. A literature without statehood lives under different conditions. It simply cannot always afford to have an impact on politics or society through poor language and poor art. Nevertheless, I hope that it has become a little clearer why anarchism and Yiddish are a worthwhile field of research, not only for Yiddishes. And thank you very much. Here's the Jewish vernacular book for the end. And